Picture this. It's June 17th, 1972, and Frank Wills is making his rounds as a security guard at the prestigious Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. It's just another night shift, or so he thinks. As he walks the corridors, something catches his eye, a door that's been left ajar. This simple observation by a security guard would trigger the most spectacular political scandal in American history. When Wills inspected that door and called the police, they discovered 5 burglars in the act of trying to bug the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. But this wasn't just any ordinary break-in. These weren't common criminals looking for cash or valuables. They were there to wiretap communications, and they were connected to the highest levels of American government. Welcome to American Scandal Report. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and we will be unpacking not just what happened, but why it happened, how psychology played a role in the decision-making, and whether anything really changed when the dust settled. This isn't just a story about a burglary. It's a story about power, paranoia, and the dangerous psychology of those who wield authority. Looking for a deep dive into America's most jaw-dropping scandals? Skoob brings you American Scandal Report. Fast, gripping podcasts that uncover true crime, political intrigue, and historic cover-ups like the Watergate scandal, the Montauk Project, the Clinton-Lewinsky affair, and more. With thousands of minutes of riveting audio and a passionate community of listeners, Skoob is your go-to for scandal stories that keep you hooked. Follow and subscribe to American Scandal Report on Skoob to explore the hidden truths behind America's biggest controversies. Only on Skoob. Coming back to the Watergate scandal, it is important that in order to understand Watergate, we have to understand Richard Nixon's worldview. By 1972, Nixon had developed what can only be described as a Manichaean view of America, a deep-seated belief that the nation was divided into good Americans and bad Americans. This wasn't just political rhetoric. This was how he genuinely saw the world. This black and white thinking created what Nixon felt was an imperative need to secure his re-election at any cost. But there was something else driving this desperation, a skeleton in the closet that could destroy him if it ever came to light. You see, Nixon and his allies had engaged in clandestine efforts to undermine the Vietnam peace talks back in 1968, potentially prolonging that devastating war for political gain. If he lost in 1972, this bombshell might be exposed. Enter the committee to re-elect the president, which became infamously known by the acronym CREEP, as their dubious tactics were exposed, and dubious is putting it mildly. These weren't your typical campaign dirty tricks. Creep engaged in what their own legal advisors called rat-fucking, a colourful term for political sabotage that would make modern opposition researchers blush. Their strategies were breathtakingly audacious. They planted forged letters in newspapers to spread misinformation about Democratic candidates. They commissioned vendors for Democratic rallies and then simply refused to pay, leaving the Democrats with unpaid bills and angry suppliers. They infiltrated opposition camps with spies, gathering intelligence like they were running operations against a foreign enemy. One of the most telling examples involved a young operative named Roger Stone. Yes, that Roger Stone, who would later become a fixture in American politics. Stone's assignment was to pretend to be a socialist and donate to one of Nixon's Republican primary challengers. He then presented the donation receipt to a reporter as evidence that this opponent was aligned with the political left, undermining their credibility with conservative voters. It was creative, it was effective, and it was completely unethical. But Nixon's team didn't stop at domestic operations. Under his administration, the United States orchestrated what would become a prototype for toppling Democratic leaders without obvious American fingerprints. When Chilean voters elected Salvador Allende, a moderate socialist, as president, Nixon's government collaborated with the CIA to destabilize his presidency. They incited a nationwide truckers' strike in the fall of 1972 that lasted 26 days, creating a labor crisis that crippled Allende's new government. The plan worked perfectly. In September 1973, right-wing dictator Augusto Pinochet seized control in a military coup. The United States then supported Pinochet's brutal regime, which became notorious for its terror tactics, including the horrific practice of throwing political opponents from helicopters. This was Nixon's world, one where democratic norms were obstacles to be overcome, where the ends always justified the means, and where anyone who opposed him wasn't just a political opponent, but a threat to America itself. Now, here's where the story gets really fascinating from a psychological perspective. How do intelligent people make catastrophically stupid decisions? The Watergate break-in itself was such a decision, and understanding how it happened reveals something profound about human psychology and the power of influence. At the center of this decision was G. Gordon Liddy, tasked with overseeing intelligence gathering operations for Nixon's re-election committee. Liddy's judgment was questionable at best, but he had a plan. And what a plan it was. Here's the thing that makes this story almost absurd. By 1972, Nixon was virtually guaranteed to win re-election. His strongest potential opponent, Edmund Muskie, had already faltered, and the likely Democratic nominee was George McGovern, whom most political observers considered highly beatable. Nixon was sitting pretty. He didn't need to take extraordinary risks. Yet Liddy proposed exactly that. An operation that was extravagant, risky, and exorbitantly expensive. He wanted $250,000 in untraceable cash for a plan that involved bugging and burglarizing Democratic offices, among other audacious ideas. The plan required the discretion and cooperation of multiple operatives, making it inherently vulnerable to exposure. And the target, the Democratic National Committee, led by Chairman Lawrence O'Brien, posed no apparent threat that could justify such a dangerous undertaking. So why did John Mitchell, the director of the committee to re-elect the president, along with his associates Jeb Stuart Magruder and Frederick LaRue, approve such a seemingly foolish plan? The answer lies in a psychological phenomenon that demonstrates the power of what experts call rejection then retreat strategy, combined with perceptual contrast. You see, the $250,000 budget wasn't Liddy's first proposal. Initially, Liddy had pitched a $1 million scheme involving elaborate criminal undertakings. A communications chase plane, multiple break-ins, potential kidnappings, and even a honey trap operation using call girls on a yacht to blackmail politicians. When this grandiose proposal was rejected, he scaled it back to $500,000. When that too was rejected, he presented his bare-bones proposal of $250,000. Psychologically, this progression was brilliant, perhaps accidentally so. By starting with extreme propositions, the final request seemed modest by comparison. As Magruder later testified, starting with that stunning figure of $1 million made the $250,000 figure seem acceptable. After Liddy had initially asked for the whole loaf, a quarter of it seemed like a reasonable compromise. The psychological principle at work here is perceptual contrast combined with reciprocity. When someone makes an outrageous request and then retreats to something smaller, the smaller request feels not just reasonable but generous, like a concession. The decision makers felt compelled to give Liddy a little something so as not to send him away completely empty-handed after he'd shown the audacity to reach for the stars. Interestingly, there was one voice of dissent during the fateful meeting, Frederick LaRue, who noted that the plan simply wasn't worth the risks. But here's the crucial detail. LaRue hadn't been part of the earlier discussions where Liddy's more ambitious plans were presented. This lack of exposure to the extreme proposals gave him a clear-eyed view of the situation, untainted by the contrast effect that influenced Mitchell and Magruder. This psychological manipulation led to one of the most consequential bad decisions in American political history. It shows how even sophisticated, experienced individuals can be maneuvered into agreeing to surprisingly poor choices through subtle psychological strategies. The immediate aftermath of the Watergate break-in revealed how unprepared Nixon's team was for getting caught. Initially, the scandal didn't gain substantial media traction. Nixon went on to win a landslide re-election victory, securing a commanding 60.7% of the popular vote and a staggering 520-17 margin in the Electoral College. For a moment, it seemed like the break-in might be dismissed as a minor footnote to a triumphant campaign. But the Washington Post had other ideas. Starting on October 10, 1972, the Post launched a serious journalistic investigation, framing the break-in as a major moral issue. Two relatively unknown reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, began pulling at threads that would eventually unravel the entire Nixon presidency. The investigation revealed that one of the burglars, James McCord Jr., was both the security officer for the committee to re-elect the president and a former CIA operative. Another burglar's possessions led investigators to E. Howard Hunt, a White House aide with intimate connections to high-level officials, including Special Counsel Charles Colson, and his own CIA background in events like the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. As these connections became public, Nixon held a hastily convened press conference where he categorically denied any White House involvement. But the administration's efforts to contain the information were already failing. The story had captured the attention of Judge John Sirica, a federal judge known for his harsh sentencing practices, earning him the nickname Maximum John. Sirica was eager for public attention and took the unusual step of handing down severe provisional life sentences to the burglars. These weren't typical sentences for first-time non-violent offenders. They were designed to pressure the burglars into testifying against members of the Nixon administration. The severity of Sirica's approach became clear when he sentenced Gordon Liddy, who refused to cooperate, to 20 years in prison and a $40,000 fine for what was essentially breaking and entering. Such harsh penalties were virtually unheard of for non-violent first-time offences, but they had their intended effect. Other participants began to crack under the pressure. As testimonies and confessions mounted through a grand jury investigation, they began to ensnare increasingly senior figures. John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, and Nixon's closest aides, Robert Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. The web of complicity was spreading upward through the highest levels of the administration. One of the most crucial figures in the Watergate investigation was John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel. Dean would become famous for his detailed testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee in June 1973, earning him the nickname the Human Tape Recorder for his seemingly photographic recall of conversations with the president. Dean's testimony was compelling and damaging to Nixon. He recounted specific conversations in the Oval Office with remarkable detail, painting a picture of a president deeply involved in the cover-up. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that reveals something profound about human memory. It was later discovered that Nixon had actually tape recorded these conversations, a practice that wasn't new among presidents. Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson had all engaged in similar recording. Nixon had initially opposed such recordings, removing Johnson's system when he took office in 1969, only to reinstall it in 1971 because he was concerned about potential historical misrepresentation of his presidency. These tapes presented a unique opportunity for Ulrich Neisser, a distinguished psychologist from Cornell University who specialized in human memory. For the first time, he could compare an individual's detailed recollection of conversations to the actual recorded dialogue, an almost unprecedented opportunity for memory research. What Neisser discovered was both fascinating and troubling. Dean's recollections displayed systematic distortions that often portrayed Dean in a more favorable light, frequently amplifying his role in events beyond what actually occurred. More significantly, Dean's memory was frequently erroneous, not just in minor details but in the broader themes and overall essence of conversations. Upon comparing Dean's account with the authentic transcripts, Neisser found that hardly a word of Dean's account is true. This wasn't necessarily because Dean was lying. It was because human memory is far more fallible and self-serving than we typically recognize. Dean's extensive 245-page prepared statement to the Watergate Committee couldn't have been composed solely from memory. Instead, Dean had engaged in a process of reconstruction, using a compilation of newspaper clippings he had maintained from the time of the Watergate break-in to the hearings. This collection functioned as a memory aid, allowing him to thoroughly outline events and reinsert himself into each described scenario. It's crucial to note that Dean was recounting events from merely 9 months prior, not distant historical occurrences. Despite this short time frame, significant memory distortions had crept in. When senators praised his impressive recall abilities, Dean replied, "Well, Senator, I think I have a good memory. I think that anyone who recalls my student years knew that I was very fast at recalling information, retaining information." This case provides valuable insights into the complexities of human memory and how even the most acclaimed memories can be susceptible to revisions and inaccuracies driven by subjective interpretation and self-perception. It raises important questions about eyewitness testimony and the reliability of even detailed personal accounts of significant events. Curious about the hidden truths behind America's most shocking scandals? Skoob dives deep into stories of crime, corruption, and political intrigue with American Scandal Report. We don't just tell tales, we unravel mysteries, revealing the secrets beneath the headlines. With thousands of minutes of gripping audio and a dedicated community of listeners, Skoob brings you closer to the scandals that shaped the nation. Tune in and subscribe to American Scandal Report on Skoob for your front row seat to the untold stories. Now, while the public focused on the break-in and cover-up, a more complex game was playing out behind the scenes, one that reveals Watergate as much more than a simple case of political corruption. This was a battle between different factions within the American power structure, each with their own interests and motivations. The eventual revelation of Deep Throat's identity provides a perfect example of this complexity. For years, the mysterious source who provided crucial information to Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward remained unknown. When Deep Throat was finally revealed to be FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt, it became clear that his motivations were far from altruistic. Felt wasn't driven by a noble desire to expose corruption. He was engaged in his own power play. He hoped that Nixon, frustrated by the leaks, would replace FBI Director Patrick Gray with himself. Felt wanted to become the FBI director, and bringing down Nixon's administration was simply a means to that end. The irony is almost poetic. Felt was later convicted of conspiring to violate American citizens' constitutional rights as one of only 2 FBI officials convicted for COINTELPRO-related crimes. This was the FBI's counterintelligence program that had systematically violated the rights of American citizens for years. This pattern of institutional self-interest over principle was not unique to Felt. J. Edgar Hoover had obstructed Nixon's Houston plan not out of concern for civil liberties, but because it threatened the FBI's bureaucratic turf. The political tumult of the era was characterized by complex interplays of power and self-interest, rather than clear-cut battles between good and evil. The anthropologist Nicholas Dirks characterized public scandals as ritualistic episodes where the sacrifice of a few individuals allows for the uninterrupted continuation of scandalous activities, albeit with some superficial safeguards meant to prevent past excesses. This observation perfectly captures what happened with Watergate. It seemed more like a clash between different factions of high-level wrongdoers, rather than a genuine effort to eliminate corruption. The broader context supports this interpretation. Just a decade after the formal end of the COINTELPRO program, the FBI was using similar tactics against leftist protest groups like the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, employing phone taps, mail interception, and possibly office burglaries. The Iran-Contra affair of 1986 exposed ongoing covert operations conducted by the Reagan administration, which illegally funded Nicaraguan guerrillas through clandestine arms sales to Iran. These events made it clear that post-Watergate reforms had not effectively curtailed illicit government activities. Conservative writer Victor Lasky's 1977 book, It Didn't Start with Watergate, attempted to defend Nixon by chronicling questionable practices by previous presidents. Franklin Roosevelt's use of the FBI to monitor opponents of his foreign policy, Harry Truman's ties to the corrupt Pendergast machine, the Kennedy brothers' heavy-handed targeting of Teamsters leader Jimmy Hoffa, and Lyndon Johnson's use of the CIA to spy on Barry Goldwater's campaign. Even Noam Chomsky observed that many of the illicit FBI activities under Kennedy and Johnson were more severe than those leading to Nixon's impeachment. This broader historical context suggests that Nixon's real crime wasn't engaging in political repression. It was getting caught and, more importantly, targeting the wrong people. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Watergate era was how it coincided with a broader shift in American attitudes toward authority and justice. Suddenly, courtrooms, juries, and judges began showing unexpected leniency toward radical figures who had previously been automatic targets for conviction. Angela Davis, a known communist, was found not guilty by an all-white jury on the West Coast, a verdict that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Members of the Black Panther Party, an organization that had been systematically targeted for governmental suppression, were acquitted in multiple trials, showcasing growing skepticism toward the government's portrayal of these groups. In Western Massachusetts, a judge dismissed charges against young activist Sam Lovejoy, who had toppled a 500-foot tower erected by a utility company planning a nuclear facility. In Washington, D.C., a Superior Court judge chose not to sentence 6 men who had stepped out of a White House tour line to protest the bombing of Cambodia. These cases reflected a deepening public aversion to government policies, particularly those associated with the Vietnam War. The war had taken 55,000 American lives, exposed profound moral failings, and revealed extensive government falsehoods and brutalities. But the Watergate scandal intensified this disillusionment exponentially. The combination of Vietnam and Watergate created a perfect storm of lost faith in American institutions. The public had been lied to about both the war and the burglary, and the lies had come from the very highest levels of government. The political left felt vindicated in their skepticism toward authority, while those in the political center were deeply unsettled by the exposure of systemic problems within American government. Interestingly, even the political right found ways to use Watergate to their advantage, taking pleasure in spotlighting the misdeeds of past Democratic administrations. Despite often defending national security agencies, Republicans used revelations about historical misconduct as ammunition against their opponents. However, mainstream media embraced a simpler narrative, casting Watergate as an anomaly and viewing Nixon's eventual resignation as proof that the system's self-correcting capabilities were working. This perspective extended to other revelations about FBI and CIA abuses, suggesting that wrongdoing was isolated to rogue elements rather than indicative of systemic problems. The reality, as subsequent events would prove, was that the misuse of power persisted regardless of which party held office or which individuals were sacrificed to public outrage. By fall 1973, the pressure on Nixon had become unbearable. 8 separate resolutions for impeachment had been introduced in the House of Representatives. By 1974, a House committee had formulated a formal bill of impeachment for a full House vote. Nixon's advisors warned him that the resolution would likely pass and that the Senate might achieve the 2/3 majority required to remove him from office. Faced with this reality, Nixon chose to resign on August 8, 1974, making history as the first and only US president to resign from office. Interestingly, 6 months before Nixon's resignation, Dunn's Review, a business magazine, had published a survey of 300 corporate executives, many of whom had supported Nixon in 1972. The survey revealed that a majority now believed he should step down. One vice president at Merrill Lynch Government Securities commented, "Right now, 90% of Wall Street would cheer if Nixon resigns." When Nixon finally did resign, widespread relief resonated across various segments of the establishment. Gerald Ford, who assumed the presidency, declared, "Our long national nightmare is over." Newspapers across the country, whether liberal or conservative, whether previously supportive of Nixon or not, celebrated what they saw as a peaceful and orderly resolution to the crisis. Anthony Lewis, a longtime critic of the Vietnam War and New York Times columnist, remarked, "The system is working." Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward opined that Nixon's departure might herald a period of restoration. But not everyone shared this optimism. Claude Julien, editor of Le Monde Diplomatique, noted that while Nixon's departure was significant, it left unchanged the underlying mechanisms and false values that had given rise to Watergate. He pointed out that Henry Kissinger would continue as Secretary of State, suggesting the persistence of Nixon's foreign policies. Washington would likely maintain support for dictators like General Pinochet in Chile, General Geisel in Brazil, and General Stroessner in Paraguay. The transition revealed the establishment's true priorities. Top Democratic and Republican leaders in the House had privately assured Nixon that his resignation would preclude any endorsement of criminal proceedings against him. A senior Republican member of the Judiciary Committee expressed concerns that protracted televised impeachment debates might fracture the country and impact foreign policy. As one financier told the New York Times, Nixon's resignation would result in the same play with different players. This prediction proved remarkably accurate. Gerald Ford, Nixon's conservative successor, gained endorsements from across the political spectrum. Liberal Senator Alan Cranston from California endorsed Ford, highlighting a bipartisan consensus forming around him. The New York Times described the transition as a testament to American democracy's resilience. When the House Committee on Impeachment leveled charges against Nixon, it conspicuously avoided broader issues that had affected other presidents, such as dealings with influential corporations and the controversial bombing of Cambodia. Instead, the charges focused on unique aspects of Nixon's actions, carefully avoiding challenges to underlying policies shared by successive administrations. Theodore Sorensen, a former Kennedy advisor, characterized the misconduct revealed during Watergate as primarily personal rather than institutional. He advocated for removing corrupt individuals while preserving the barrel, the existing system. The outcomes confirmed this approach. Nixon's foreign policies and corporate ties persisted under Ford, who maintained strong connections with corporate lobbyists. Alexander Haig, a close Nixon advisor involved in handling the controversial White House tapes, was rewarded with command of NATO forces. In perhaps the most telling move, President Ford pardoned Nixon, shielding him from potential criminal charges and allowing him to enjoy retirement in California with a generous pension. Those few administration officials who faced prison received lenient sentences in accommodating facilities with special privileges. The most significant long-term impact of Watergate wasn't the removal of a corrupt president. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the federal government. In the wake of Nixon's resignation, there was a dramatic tilting of power toward Congress, representing perhaps the most significant constitutional realignment since the New Deal. This shift manifested through several legislative actions, beginning with the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which passed over Nixon's veto. This placed unprecedented limitations on the president's ability to commit U.S. forces abroad without congressional consent within 60 days, a dramatic curtailment of executive authority. Additional measures like the Jackson-Vanik and Stevenson amendments further constrained presidential foreign policy. By the mid-1970s, Congress had significantly curtailed presidential powers on multiple fronts, effectively stalling Nixon's management of the Cyprus crisis in 1974 and limiting CIA operations. In 1975, congressional action hindered presidential policy in Angola and enacted the Arms Export Control Act, stripping the president of discretion in arms supply decisions. Congress also severely curtailed the system of presidential agreements with foreign powers. Over 6,300 between 1946 and 1974, compared to just 411 treaties requiring congressional approval. Congress empowered numerous committees in both the Senate and House to supervise foreign policy and expanded its expert staff substantially. By the late 1970s, it had introduced around 70 amendments restricting presidential conduct in foreign policy. Some argued that the War Powers Act's constraints meant the president might no longer operate unhindered as commander-in-chief. But here's the crucial irony. While Watergate appeared to democratize American government by strengthening Congress, it also empowered another institution that was far less accountable to the public, the media. Prior to Watergate, political espionage and surveillance weren't viewed as particularly serious offenses. In 1964, President Johnson had reportedly bugged Barry Goldwater's campaign headquarters. In 1968, NBC allegedly bugged Democratic Party headquarters. Major newspapers regularly published stolen material when they deemed it newsworthy, including memoirs by H.R. Haldeman and Henry Kissinger. But the Washington Post's relentless pursuit of the Watergate story changed this dynamic forever. The investigation that began on October 10, 1972, established the media as a co-equal branch of government, capable of bringing down presidents through sustained coverage and investigation. Some observers characterized Nixon's downfall as a media putsch, the replacement of an imperial presidency not with genuine democratic accountability, but with an empowered media and legislative branch. The 1972 electoral mandate, where Nixon had won a massive landslide, was effectively overturned not by voters, but by journalists and politicians. A July 1974 Supreme Court decision reinforced presidential powers even while requiring Nixon to surrender his tapes. The court sustained the general principle of confidentiality for presidential communications and affirmed the president's authority to safeguard military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security secrets, maintaining significant aspects of executive power even in defeat. What really lies beneath America's biggest scandals? The American Scandal Report on Skoob uncovers the power plays, betrayals, and dark secrets that rocked the nation's foundations. These aren't just headlines, they're untold stories that reveal the shadows behind history's most explosive moments. Powered by thousands of minutes of gripping audio and a dedicated community of 50,000 plus listeners, Skoob's podcast studio brings every twist and turn to life with relentless detail and fearless storytelling. From secret meetings to shattered reputations, each episode pulls you deeper into the scandals that shaped America's destiny. Follow and subscribe to American Scandal Report, because the truth is more shocking than fiction. As we reach the end of our journey through the Watergate Chronicles, we're left with a profound paradox. On one level, Watergate represented a triumph of American institutions. A corrupt president was removed, the rule of law prevailed, and the system proved capable of self-correction. The story of Frank Wills, the security guard whose simple observation triggered the downfall of the most powerful man in the world, seems to affirm that in America, no one is above the law. But on a deeper level, Watergate reveals something far more troubling about how power actually operates in America. The scandal didn't emerge because the system was designed to catch wrongdoing. It emerged because different factions within the power structure were at war with each other. Deep Throat wasn't motivated by justice, but by ambition. The harsh sentences handed down by Maximum John Sirica were designed not to uphold the law, but to pressure testimony against political enemies. The psychological manipulation that led to the break-in decision shows how even sophisticated leaders can be manipulated into catastrophically poor choices. The systematic distortions in John Dean's memory reveal how unreliable even detailed eyewitness accounts can be. The broader context of ongoing government surveillance and covert operations suggests that Nixon's real crime wasn't engaging in political repression. It was targeting the wrong people and getting caught. Perhaps most significantly, the aftermath of Watergate showed that while individual actors can be removed, the underlying systems of power remain remarkably resilient. Nixon was gone, but his foreign policies continued. The imperial presidency was curtailed, but power simply shifted to other institutions, Congress and the media, that had their own interests and blind spots. The belief that divided Americans into good and bad camps, which drove Nixon's paranoid tactics, didn't disappear with his resignation. If anything, it became more entrenched, laying the groundwork for the increasingly polarized politics that would follow. Today, as we grapple with questions about surveillance, executive power, and political polarization, the lessons of Watergate remain painfully relevant. The scandal reminds us that the most dangerous threats to democracy often come not from outside enemies, but from the corruption of power within our own institutions. Frank Wills, the security guard who started it all, died in poverty and obscurity in 2000, largely forgotten despite his role in one of the most important events in American political history. Perhaps that's fitting. In a story about power and its abuses, the ordinary citizen who exposed the truth was ultimately left behind by the very system he had helped to preserve. The Watergate Chronicles teach us that vigilance is the price of democracy, but they also remind us that justice is often messier, more complicated, and more provisional than we might hope. Sometimes the system works, but not always in the ways we expect, and not always for the reasons we're told. The door that Frank Wills found ajar that night in 1972 opened onto a labyrinth of power, paranoia, and institutional warfare that we're still navigating today. Understanding that labyrinth, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains one of the most important tasks for any citizen who believes democracy is worth preserving. That's our story for today. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the Watergate scandal. Until next time, keep questioning, keep watching, and remember, sometimes the most important truths are hidden behind doors that seem perfectly ordinary until someone bothers to look inside.